What's going on, everyone? You might have heard of a Dumble-lator, but have you ever heard of a box-lator? That's what today's topic is all about, and the reincarnation by JHS, and then my own interpretation of what's going on with the Dumble-box-lator, which is a solid-state, op-amp-driven FX loop device that Dumble made, we think early 90s, but I want to touch upon a few things. So here we are, my box-a-lator project ultimately, but we want to go through a bit of the Mayer history, the Dumble history, designing the box-a-lator, and then just sort of my own sort of circuit design when it comes to the box-a-lator interpretation of the Dumble's box-a-lator. I'm going to break this out in 3 different episodes. The first episode is going to be more of an educational side of things, talking about the history, of course. And then episode 2 will be about building one of my devices. And episode 3 will be sound tests and all the different ways that you can use a solid state FX loop in your amps, taking the high impedance side of an amp and making it low impedance so there's no signal degradation down long cable runs. So we're going to touch upon that a little bit. And also other use cases. So you might have seen John Mayer's pedal board in 2001, starting in 2001, he has on there this box-a-lator by JHS. So I'm going to talk about the drama that Alejandro from John Mayer Gear and I have been trying to chase down. What the heck is this device for the past couple years? And here's a video kind of distilling all of that. So let's go ahead and right off the bat, I'm going to basically walk through my blog entry. If you're not familiar with my webpage, it's thetonegeek.com. Got a lot of cool information here that I document on my projects and plus other research that I do. Right off the bat, our journey begins on Tumblr. So before the days of Instagram, there was a thing called Tumblr. Some of you might have been familiar with it. And John Mayer posts this picture of this thing called a box-a-lator. Back in the day, he was very much more into sharing gear and info basically on his toys that he's acquired. And if you know anything about me, I'm very fascinated by the toys that John plays with. I think they're very cool. They're very expensive. So there's like an allure behind it. And for me, being an electrical engineer background, I know that it's basically slapping together capacitors, resistors, and a couple other parts, and you can replicate the circuit, and I don't have to dish out hundreds and thousands of dollars. And I find that pretty fun, and actually it's a cool chase, right, to get the homework assignment based on what I see from my favorite musician, and then being able to kind of reverse engineer what's going on. So going back to this, a box-a-lator by Howard Dumble, an external effects loop that also acts as a line buffer clean boost. Now, I don't know exactly when this picture was posted. I tried looking it up. But what we do know is that it came back into view in John Mayer's 2013 Behind the Scenes series that John had. Basically, he picks up this box, and you can clearly see that it's a box-a-lator, the same one. He picks it up and he uses it for something we don't really know, but he has it on a pedal board. You can watch the video here. I have the video linked so you can check it out very quickly. You can, again, see it. He picks it up, he puts it down, and then in the next scene, you can actually see a little bit of the back here. So you can sort of tell, and this is as much info as we have at the time, that there seems to be 4 jacks, probably in, out, send, receive. It's no secret that that's exactly what it is. So then fast forward, and this is where my interest sort of really was piqued, was 2021, Dead & Company pedal board, Omega 0 JM on the My Stupid Mouth forum. So I don't know if you're familiar, but before Facebook groups, before Instagram, anyone that was chasing John Mayer's gear lived in My Stupid Mouth forums, and this is where I lived for quite a while and still do. And there's a lot of contributions there. So a lot of the new age John Mayer followers, I definitely recommend cruising through this forum from top to bottom, so you get a background on all of his stuff. So anyway, Omega points out a few screenshots of this little black device, and then he goes and actually finds it in the Martin Jam in Place performance. Here it is. You can sort of see already that there is a JHS logo on the bottom. We don't know what it says at this point. We have no idea what it does. I think Justin puts in that he thinks maybe it's a micro vibe of sorts or just two knobs. We obviously can see it's two knobs, and that's about it. So then, again, fast forward, we get some more ideas. We get this picture. So Josh from JHS, who we know is sort of related to this thing, and again, I'm going to tie it all together soon. This little device, I think he said forget about it was the caption on this thing. We can see that it has an input, an output, and then there's 4 jacks. So it's like, what the heck is this thing? And then finally in 2021, I think, this picture, which was a web scrape or picture scrape of a Nugs feed when John was playing with Dead & Company. We see now box-a-lator. Now, boom, does that sound sort of familiar? And it makes sense on why Josh might have been trying to hide the name of it, because it does tie into a box-a-lator, pretty close, right? And then fast forward, if you're an eagle-eyed fan, you see box-a-lator, and that's exactly the name that I give in my version and interpretation of it. Oh, no, so Josh says, sometimes mystery is a good thing. That was the caption on that one. So we finally have it. And then we have a super clear photo of it from the Tokyo performance, Blue Note performance. There was a sort of, I don't know, guitarist magazine that took very high resolution pictures. It's really cool that they were able to do that. A couple other things that you can see here is these are Ernie Ball cables. These are Ernie Ball patch cables. They're like flat cables. You see a tube screamer before, and you can sort of trace here, and I've done some manipulation in Photoshop, that coming out of the tube screamer, which is, by the way, pretty hot, it's going into here, looping around, and you can see some manipulation on these tone knobs before going into the clon. Now, rewind a little bit, you could tell based on prior pedal board shots that John has been toying with a tube screamer before a clon and then a tube screamer after the clon. And you could see here that this other tube screamer on the left is very much dialed in for the gain. So there's definitely some gain stacking going on. So what I'm interpreting this device is doing is actually attenuating the signal coming out of this tube screamer, so you're not slamming the input of the clon. So you have the high gain, that tone that you really like, and you just want to bring it down to a manageable level. Same way that you kind of sort of roll off the tone knob or roll off the volume knob on your guitar, it cleans up the signal. Now, you're not exactly cleaning up the signal going into the tube screamer. You're actually cleaning up the signal for the next stage, which is, it's kind of funny because this is kind of like what Dumble does with gain staging, right? You got different gains, and then they kind of cascade into one another. I believe I'm interpreting that correctly. But we have more dynamics is the result of having this attenuator, basically, is how is this being used. The output of the device is being attenuated down a bit. And we do know there's a boost in here. And I'm going to guess, and I have some more information on this in the future part of this video, that there is a boost component of this pedal. And it is more or less on the recovery side. So when the signal comes back into it, and I don't know how the circuit is designed based on this photo, because this could be the send going into the receive, or this could be the send going into the receive this way. There's a boost component, and I don't know which one of these two it is, but I'm pretty sure it's on the recovery either way. All right, so a little bit of the drama behind trying to figure out what the heck this is. Let's see if I can find my Amp Garage page. So I started a post on the Amp Garage. And if you're not familiar with the Amp Garage, it is basically a place where all things Dumble are discussed technically, and like what's going on the inside. There's a bunch of groups who are a bunch of awesome techs who share their knowledge on Dumble circuits, and if they come across a Dumble, they're likely to post something about it and give little cookie crumbs about what's going on. And if you know anything about me, I love the collective knowledge and just sharing information, and a lot of that happens here on the Amp Garage. This is where I got my start building guitar amplifiers, and just having the confidence to know that there's something that's probably 99% accurate about a Dumble circuit lives in the Amp Garage, and then I can learn about it. That's pretty cool. So anyway, I made this post. Does anyone know about this little box? I'm guessing it's a Dumbleator with a fixed gain. It looks kind of cheesy. However, it's a real Dumble item. It's my little quip I added at the end. And then blah blah blah. Some of our awesome members replied, and then we kind of go back and forth on what it might be. I kind of thought maybe Dumble was looking at, since we think it's a solid state device, I thought maybe he was using the FET input to his amplifier. So if you look at a Steel String Singer or an ODS, he has a FET input. And then that's sort of a conversion of sorts of impedance, and it could potentially be used as a FX loop, a solid state FX loop, very much like the clinulator. And then, I have some ideas here I post about how that circuit might be accomplished, and here's the circuit for the FET input on a Dumble amp. And then Dan, we kind of go back and forth about, hey, what are these screw holes? This may be how the circuit boards are laid out, blah, blah, blah. And then finally, Aeon Gill. Now, you might remember him from the Smooth and Slim that John Mayer used. And he's an awesome contributor, a wealth of knowledge. And anytime he leaves a breadcrumbs, they're more than just a breadcrumb. They're like, full-on info. He posts a bunch of cool pictures, which I've taken just in case this gets taken down. And I've hosted on my site. So thank you again, Gil. I'll just kind of pop over there. And then we have our first look inside of what's going on. And what I've noticed right off the bat is that there's a pretty beefy power supply. There's a transformer. There's definitely an AC cord, as we know from John's pictures. And then we can see that there's a B2K pot here and a big, huge capacitor. It's polarized based on how basically these two little ends, I don't know what there's like a crimped end that usually indicates which side is, I believe, positive on a regular capacitor. I might be wrong there. But we also see an op amp. We see a couple big box film caps. We see more filtering caps potentially. And then you see these smaller caps. And you see another pot. So this is definitely reminiscent of what we see with the JHS box-a-lator. Also, you could see directly here in his photos that he generously provided the layout and the on-off switch and things like that. Here's another angle, and we can see some resistors, which is kind of cool. These look like carbon film resistors based on the tan color, and I think these are all carbon film maybe. Another, you see the IC chip, and then we can sort of trace out how the wiring is for this device, which is super cool. Again, here's some more pictures. Here is my drawing of what I think the wiring looks like, and I'm pretty sure it's right. But we have the circuit, so with the input of the circuit kind of coming into here. I didn't illustrate that in this photo, but we have a component count based on my educated guess. I'm pretty sure that this little blue device, and this is key, by the way, this little blue thing right here is a capacitor, because I looked at prior Dumble amplifiers, and he does use tantalum capacitors, that blue type. So that might be part of the boost circuit. And based on the topology here, I can take an educated guess that it is on the recovery side. So the device, the signal comes into this mythical device, and then the output of it goes through this bipolar capacitor directly into this drive pot, which we do know is a B2K. So it's a linear 2K pot for that low impedance drive. That's the thing that really sets up for long cable runs, great tone through low impedance. You want basically the input to the op amp to be high impedance, is how that works. And there's a ratio. You want it usually 10 times longer. But anyway, or 10 times bigger than the low impedance side. And then on your return circuit, I am able to trace that the return goes through a pot, very much like a Dumble-lator, and which is another FX loop, but it uses a tube to convert the high impedance to low impedance. Goes back into the circuit. So there is this pot, and I'm going to guess that Dumble was trying to mimic the way that the traditional Dumble-lator, the tube-driven Dumble-lator works, where you don't overdrive the incoming, well, you basically attenuate the incoming signal, which should be low impedance to begin with. So this pot is, I don't know what it is at this point, and I have some changes I'll show you later on in this video. But at this point, I don't know what it is, but I do know it's very dependent on the impedance of the signal that's driving it. And we know that likely, if you're going to use an FX loop, you're going to have a pedal or some sort of low impedance drive going into this device. So if you were to plug a direct guitar into the recovery or the return, it's probably not going to sound that good because, you know, the impedance, it's just not going to be good. You might have experienced this in the past. Your tone is dragged down. You have no dynamics. And a lot of that has to do with the impedance and the loading of the pickups. So we do know that in FX loops are pretty safe because you're usually going to have a device in here. So those are my observations to this point, right? So we know that John has this cool device, and he's using it mainly as an attenuator, less like a true FX loop. And there's this sort of loop going on. The size of the box is probably a 1590 BB sized box, maybe a little taller. And then inside, oh, by the way, there's a power supply. The power supply is super important in this design. And that is because to get the most of an op amp, you typically might have seen like the Klon uses a charge pump. And that's to convert the 9-volt DC into, you know, whatever you want, within reason, of course. But for an op amp, ideally, you want to be plus and minus 15 volts, which gives you a 30-volt swing. So your incoming signal will not be squished or clipped by the op amp and the low headroom based on just having a 9-volt input. If you convert that 9-volt input or that 9-volt capability of that, you're really, I mean, you're getting 9 volts, but you're going positive 4.5 ideally, and then negative 4.5 to get that 9 volts. But it's in reality a little bit different. But I don't want to get into that too much. What one of our members on the Amp Garage pointed out was that, hey, look at the orientation of these capacitors. It looks like there's a bipolar power supply in here. Now, I think that that makes sense because if Dumble was going to create a device that's super high quality like he's known for and maintains the tone as much as possible, you would want a bipolar power supply. And we're going to guess that it's either plus or minus 12 volts, or really, if you can really amp it up to plus or minus 15 volts, that's ideal. So there's probably, this is a regulator. So this regulator is regulating the circuit. I think it's really cool that he designed his own power supply here. And these things are pretty rare. I think there's only two. There's the picture that John posted, and then there's this picture that that Gil posted as well. And prior, I might have head is, I think it's Gil Aon, not Aon Gil. All right, so next I want to talk about a little bit of research. We do know that this pedal, we think just based on the form back and forth and the colors and the Hammond enclosure, that this is early 1990s, we think, this device. And Dumble was a very, was great at coming up with their own circuits, but they always were rooted into something. So there's traces that have been found of his circuits, designs going into, electronics magazines from the 70s, even, obviously Fender. He was modifying Fender amplifiers and things like that. But so that sort of reminded me, hey, there might be something already out there that he copied. Oh, and let's not forget that the power supply or the power amp section of the, I'm going to say the Dumbleland, is very reminiscent of a Macintosh hi-fi power amp, by the way. So that's just kind of funny. It takes his preamp, puts them into kind of known power amp, does his little change here and there to fit his needs and his hearing, and then boom, you have a cool new Dumble. So let's try to figure out, during that era, in early 90s, there are some solid-state FX loops in amps, specifically Marshall amps. Here's one of the things, and here's kind of a circuit layout that I've done a comparison in Photoshop. Mine is on the left, and Marshall is here on the right. We learn a few things. We learn, some values here, what the pot is. This is an adjustable FX loop from the send. And then the receive has, some information about what pots might be used. Here's a B10K, which is interesting, right? A linear 10K pot, and then a 3.3 resistor, kind of that floor. And here's some level, blah, 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 going into this op amp. TL072. Now, TL072 is a very widely used op amp. It's not what I ended up liking in the end. I mean, not that I didn't like the TL072. I just find that the OPA 2134 is designed for audio applications, and so that's why I try to use it. I think it sounds great. But since I socket my designs, I could definitely try a TL072. Maybe I'll do that in a tone video to see if there's any difference. But then I came across this Marshall amp, and it has a solid state. I think it's a 1959 model number. I'm not very good at Marshall numbers and model numbers, and I'm not very good at BMW either. I'm like, well, what the heck? Z4s look cool, and then that's all I got. M4s, are they the same? But here we have some interesting information, and you can see where I've drawn in my own circuit some parallels. So interestingly, there is a variable sort of thing going on the input side of here, and I believe that that's more or less for input impedance coming in from the tube amp side. So I thought, you know what, why don't I take my interpretation of the circuit, and I know that Dumble didn't have trim pots in his and whatever, but let me cover all the grounds. So if there is some concrete evidence of what the circuit is that is in the A box-a-lator by Dumble, I can sort of tweak my trim pots to dial in what's going on. Best educated guess, right? So let me see how close I can get. Here we have a 68K. Whoops. And by the way, I have all these photos on my photo album that I publish, free to use, free to see, all linked in my blog entry here. You see that there's a 68K on the bottom end, and then it goes all the way up. You add these all together and you get about 1 meg. So knowing that the tolerance of trim pots and everything is around 20%, I think it's fair to say that if I have a 68K resistor here on the bottom floor, I can just have a trim pot, and I call this the input drag part of my circuit. It's definitely setting up some impedance things. Here's another bias. Here's a bias resistor in this circuit. It's a 10 meg. Now, without going too much into it, the higher your resistance, the more likely there's input shot noise. I don't know. That's, again, theoretical. I didn't do too much playing around, to be honest, but I do know that 1 meg is widely accepted for an input bias. And also looking at spec sheets, doing the best that I can to research it, I think I'm good with 1 meg. And my observation here also is that there's a 470 ohm resistor. And if you remember back in this photo, these bands kind of look like 470 ohm bands. The purple, the yellow, looks like 470. I'm just going to say it. So I'm pretty confident at this point that 470 ohm is here. So I think that this is the topology for the Dumble A box-a-lator at this point. We have this capacitor. It's not bipolar, but we know Dumble like to do things better. So I think that that is 470 ohm, but he used a bipolar version of it. And so did I. There is no adjustable output at this point. It looks just fairly standard and flat. So, I mean, I guess maybe the impedance here would make it sort of adjustable from a levels output of the send jack. But you can see here that the output impedance is also with the 68K. Dumble had, remember again, in that picture, the drive pot is linear 2K. And that's fine. That's actually might be an upgrade because it's, again, low impedance coming out of this device, driving down long signal cables and stuff. But I want to talk a little bit at this point what that means in the circuit. I'm taking a little bit of a risk here. So I've linked this schematic and the circuit before in my blog post. So here's LT Spice. So I've actually spiced the circuit, and I'm going to not make this one over here variable gain. I'm going to set it for max. So right now, the way that my circuit interpretation is, we are going to just have unity gain when the send and return, or close to unity gain, is at max. And I'm probing the output of this device. Actually, I could probably probe it here. And then we can sort of see the difference more accurately. Right now, this simulation is using a 10K pot. And I'm going to change that pot to a 2K. Not linear. I'm going to change it to audio taper. Not that this matters at this point. Oh, audio. But watch the levels. Here is basically the signal coming in is, again, 0 dB by comparison. And we're going to see that it's, can't resolve, what'd I do? Error. All right. Oh, you know why? I think I got to do A. The modules I used is a little different. Anyway, so now I'm simulating the circuit. If you notice here on the left that the levels actually dropped by about 2 decibels. Now, usually, hope I get this right, 3 decibels is human ear perceivable drops or amplification in levels. So 3, it's basically half the power or whatever. It's a step. If you use a 2K pot, you are inherently dragging down the signal around 2 dB. And this is noticeable. I built my prototype using 2K pots, and what you have coming into the device is not what you get out. So if you're using this device to drive, like another pedal of sorts, the tone is going to be dropped, and therefore you might not get the same reaction that you're expecting, because coming out of either your amplifier preamp out or your pedal that's going into this device is not going to be the same level coming out. But through simulation and plus my known knowledge about pedals, if I set this as a 10K pot, guess what? That signal is brought very, very close to unity, if ever so slightly. And the only way to get around that ever so slight drop is you can even go higher. But then you get into like sort of diminishing returns. And again, you want this impedance to be as low as possible for the maintaining the highest quality of the signal going down the cables. So anyway, and also 100K is also acceptable. And I do recommend, if you are designing and building the circuit, using audio taper pots, because it just makes sense. There's a Thevenin equivalent. You can do all sorts of math and research. I don't want to get into that here, but just want to point that out. And then on the return side, I also settled with 10K, not linear, but I did settle on 10K audio taper pots. So 10K drive, 10K recover pots. You can download this. You can play with this all on my website as well, and come up with your own conclusions. On the recovery side, there's nothing crazy here. We see a 470 nanofarad capacitor. You might have seen this 100 resistor, 100R, and then this 100 picofarad. This is sort of what I've learned cruising pedal forums and pedal building forums for designing circuits. This is more or less RF rejection. It makes a stable op-amp experience, less noisy. I wanted this thing to be as quiet as possible. So I have both on the inputs and the return, well, so the input and then the return has that filtering going on. And you can see the rest of the circuit. The boost is very heavily inspired, and I hope I get it right, by Barbaratech Thunder Boost circuit. So during my investigation on how to build the cleanest and the highest headroom boost, I came across this forum entry and more or less lifted it. All the research is there, and a lot of this makes sense. So I highly recommend reading this article if you're interested in boost circuits. And then, you know, he or she has a bunch of other cool projects, very recent, by the way, projects. And then it's kind of like Electro Smash. If you're familiar with building pedals, Electro Smash, this feels like an extension of Electro Smash with the analysis. They make the LT Spice available to you, so that's cool. And I know I'm getting deep into the circuit design, which might be a turnoff for some of you, but if you are sticking around, I really appreciate that you're still here. A lot of this is now my interpretation. I wanted it to look and feel like the JHS box, but I don't want to copy it. Now, if you watch any of Josh's video, he's very much against lead or trade dress. So I wanted to come up with a similar design, but my own sort of thing. I wanted the boost, again, this is coming back to how do I make little hooks in here, tasteful hooks into the circuit. So if the real A Box-a-lator by Dumble circuit is revealed, you know, maybe it's a trim pot or two adjustment, and then boom, what I have built already is exactly what is in that design. So I externalized the boost circuit with a pot, an external pot, so you have full control over the boost side of the recovery after the recovery. So in the circuit, you have coming in here, here's the boost side of the circuit. It's obviously on the recovery. So then if you want to boost up that signal for whatever reason, you can go ahead and make that adjustment. If you want to compensate for any sort of signal loss, so if you have, for example, a Marshall blues breaker, you can set up your blues breaker like John did with his thing here, but pretend like this TS10 is a blues breaker. A lot of people complain that the output of that blues breaker is too low. Well, guess what? I have a device for you. It's my box or the circuit in general or some sort of boost. I like mine best because I know it's clean. It's very flat as far as the response, as you can tell from my LT Spice, and I've done my own circuit sort of analysis here, as you can see. I'll get that into a second. So basically if you have that Marshall Blues Breaker, you want it louder, use my box to do it. All right, getting into the design a bit. Here I have my easy EDA. That's how I sort of design everything. This is a 4-layer circuit board. So if you follow my recent designs, I like 4-layer circuit boards because of what I've experienced reverse engineering Vemoram's circuit boards, and they use 4-layer. The very top layer is a ground, the very bottom layer is a ground, and all the little wires connecting in here is basically the circuit board itself acts like mini coax wires going to and from each of the devices, which is really, really cool. It's in theory going to make things quieter. The voltage isn't something to worry about, because some people may jump out right now and be like, well, you might have some issues with your higher voltage jumping, and that's creating a capacitor layer. 15 volts is not going to do that. Plus 15 volts minus is not going to do that. And then this is my first time ever breaking and separating out the foot switch, which I am mounting here because of the charge pump circuit. It's not a charge pump, actually. It's a DC to DC converter. I found that DC and DC converting circuit from Aeon Electronics, who I've been, admiring for years. Actually, my first pedal I've ever built was using an Aeon Electronics circuit. Here on my page, the L5 preamp has the DC to DC converter, and it's all around this really cool device. It's a DC-DC device that works at 100 kilohertz frequency. If you're ever used a Klon and had some clock noise or just some whining when you have some other weird involvement with other circuits, that's because that charge pump is operating at an audible frequency. And that's ungood when it comes to audio circuits. So this device is really cool that it switches, or it, internally works at way above the audio frequency. But just as a in case thing, I've separated and physically the designs. So here's the charge, or the DC to DC conversion circuit over here on the far side, and all of my signals are handled as far away from that as possible. So you see the input here, which is basically the most sensitive, is coming in and way away from that charge, or that DC to DC conversion circuit, and then the output comes over there. The output is less susceptible to interference. And then you have that design. You can see my non-polar capacitor that I've used, and then a whole bunch of other parts. Because in the future, those OPA 2134 chips and also other chips in general are going mainly surface mount. My next version of the circuit board, I don't have any of these made right now, but have their own sort of 8-pin surface mount conversion already on the board. So you don't need to buy an adapter, in other words, unless you want to be able to adapt it out. All right. So one of the other things I wanted to touch upon, again, this is an evolution, and here we are in the sort of circuit design phase of this video. The evolution, that what I've learned, especially with FX loops, is you might have some grounding hum, and you could use a hum eliminator or a transformer. There wasn't enough room in here to put a transformer, but you might be able to fit one down here, but I just didn't want to do that. So what I've done, and what I've sort of standardized on in this design, I don't commonly do this, but I'm using plastic Nutric jacks. Now, you can ground those jacks simply by, you can see here, by grounding them, putting them to ground, and then you got a ground over here, and guess what? That jack is now grounded. As far as the enclosure, now you might say, okay, well, what about the enclosure? Because you don't have a star washer or anything. I'm actually fine, because what I've done is taking the lock washer. I've attached a wire, soldered a little wire to it, and then I'm attaching that, just because it's convenient, over to the grounding part of the circuit. So now we have more or less a pseudo star ground, where you have the power ground comes into this device, and then all ground is going basically on this one circuit board. You see all these little holes? Those are vias, and they're connecting the ground planes together. So you, again, very, very much aware of the grounding and how important that is for circuits, and the quality of the ground is super important for keeping ground loops to a minimum. One thing I've done since this sort of layout is I've included a switch. So if you recently bought a pedal from me, I have a ground lift switch, which is on the send pot. It's just simply breaking this ground, adding it to the switch, and the ground output, so either you have ground or you don't for the FX loop, also includes a return. So you're lifting the ground from the send and return. It should not create any sort of problems with being shocked or any sort of thing like that, any worry. It's simply lifting the ground on the wires or on the cables, on the guitar cables going into the send and return. So that's a little trick that I didn't publish here. You can see on my site, and this is why it's important to check back frequently, is I did have an edit that talks about using an audio taper 10K pot. And here's all my photo albums that I referenced earlier, which gives you like everything. You can sort of see here all the things. And very quickly, here's using my scope, and then here's a bunch of testing that I've done using my scope. What do I want to illustrate here? All right, so let's talk headroom for a second. And it's important to interpret the yellow is the incoming signal. And I have this set at around 700 millivolts peak to peak, which is around 0 decibels, I guess. And going through the boost circuit, I'm able to, so what I'm doing is I have that incoming signal, which is about 0 dB, and I wanted to see how far I can push it before the signal starts clipping. And again, this speaks to the headroom of this device. We know that maximum, we're going to have 30 volts to play with. I was able to pretty closely accomplish this. And look at the scale. Here we have 5 volts DC. So every single step is 5 volts. So we have, I don't have my glasses on. So we have one, I'm pretty sure. Let's see if I can zoom in. I can't. 1, 2, 3. Very close, super close to 15 volts. Positive swing, and then you have on the negative swing, 1, 2, 3. Super close to negative 15 volts headroom. Again, crazy headroom means cleanest tone. Drive this sucker as hard as you can, and guess what? That op amp is not going to be the limiting factor of the circuit. I want to talk about flat response here for a second. Check this out. This is the boost at maximum boost. And here's where we're getting about very close, a little bit more than 24.25 decibels of flat decibel response. So you can boost your signal up to about 24 dB, and it's going to be clean. There's a little bit of DC roll off as part of it, but you're looking for guitar frequencies. You're not going to be talking 40 hertz. What is this? 20, 30, 40 hertz. And then it starts to really, be flat. Yeah, you're not going to, that's not going to be a problem. Trust me. And then some other graphs, of course. So I am very much taking a scientific approach to it. And I talked a little bit about ways you can use this device. Here's simply an amplifier FX loop. Here you got your incoming signal. And I have this drawn a little bit backwards on this side, but your input of your device could be again, from your preamp into your modulation, delay, reverb, blah, 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 and then through your return and then into the FX return of your power amp section for whatever manipulated signal you want after your preamp. Here's what a finished device looks like. You have your little ribbon cable. I'm usually not a fan of this sort of thing, but I've warmed up to it because I don't think it's going to be an issue with breaking, especially if people aren't going to be using it. It looks like there's enough slack, obviously. Here, I'm using, again, those plastic jacks, so there's no ground loops between, or I have the ability to break a ground from the device without having it, locked in to the enclosure, which is grounded with this wire here. And I did add because customers think my LEDs are very bright sometimes, a LED brightness adjustment. What does my device look like in the end? Again, we'll get into how to build one in the next video, but here's the end result. Here's number 4 again, and I have my new fancy stickers, and this is what it looks like against my brand new PRS Dead spec. And if you know anything about me, I'm a big Dead & Company fan, which did introduce me into the Grateful Dead, and I'm very, very happy that I've discovered that. And thank you, John, for being the conduit for it. All right, the last thing I want to point out in my design is you look at the LED. There's this little silver ring around it, and that is a nod. And let's see, here's my Goros. It's a knockoff. I don't have $10,000 to put on a necklace around my neck. See this ring? This is a nod to the Dumble device, because if you look in the front here, guess what? Very, very similar. Very, very similar LED. So that's my own knob. It's not what is on JHS. The JHS box, they use a little plastic crappy thing. I didn't like that. I wanted Dumble. I wanted it to be a tribute to Dumble. So there you go. And here's some awesome slow-mo of another one that I built. You can see here the switch I'm talking about. Simply using the switch here to break the ground, and also I can add the ground back in for the send and receive. All right, so I think that's about it I want to cover in this video. On the next video, I want to talk about, let's see here. All right, so on the next video, I'm going to be going over how to build one of these cool things. And then the third video, again, is going to be a audible test of sorts, and I can kind of run through all the use cases that I mentioned earlier, and we can actually hear it and what that means. How do we attenuate a signal? How do you boost a signal? What does that mean for the next pedal in line? So a lot of cool things. This is a really cool device. Outside my own sort of sort of tooting my own horn here about what all the cool things my device does. It doesn't seem like there's too many solid state devices that are out there for FX loops and things. But if you do know of one that you think is pretty cool and very similar, please reach out to me. I'd love to compare and contrast, and maybe I'll find one or buy one to check out. So again, I'm happy to be back. I'll be doing more videos. Please like and subscribe and all that other YouTube crap, and I'll talk soon.